Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our In Focus webinar for today, Trauma-Informed Practice in Your Learning Community. My name is Sally Gissing. I'm an Implementation Manager here in the BU team at Beyond Blue. And a little bit about me before we get started. So I've been in the education sector for over 10 years now as a primary and secondary teacher, and also managing school-based education and wellbeing initiatives. I'm really excited to have so many people, so many of you join us from around Australia today. It's great having you all here. Given that we have a large number of attendees, we've placed you into listen-only mode. So this just means that you're not able to use your mic or your webcam, but you're certainly able to use your questions box, which is in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen if you're on a desktop. And we really encourage you to send through any comments, questions that you have throughout the session. We'd love to hear from you. So if you're new to BU and you're wondering what it's all about, BU is a national online initiative. It's free and it's funded by the Commonwealth Government and led by Beyond Blue, working closely with our delivery partners, Early Childhood Australia and Headspace. It's really all about empowering you as educators, along with your early learning services and schools, to support the mental health of children and young people in your care by building mentally healthy learning communities. We're really keen to work with you to build and grow a mentally healthy generation where it's normal to actively look after your mental health and seek help if needed, because like we all know, there's no health without mental health. So I'm coming to you from Melbourne today, and our co-presenters from Emerging Minds, Nicola and Margaret, are dialing in from Adelaide. But I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land of which I stand today, which are the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. Also, considering that we're all dialing in from across Australia, I would like to extend my respects to elders and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from across Australia, and really encourage you to think about the lands that you're joining us from today and what that connection means to you. We certainly recognise the importance of certainly recognise the importance of continued connection to culture, country and community, to the health and social and emotional well-being of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people and their families. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our subject matter experts today from Emerging Minds and the Australian Child and Adolescent Trauma, Loss and Grief Network, Margaret Nixon and Nicola Palfrey. Welcome,
hello.
Ladies. Hello,
Hi.
hello. So Nicola is a clinical psychologist and researcher and has an extensive experience working with children, adolescents and adults who have experienced significant adversity and trauma. And she's the director of the Australian Child and Adolescent Trauma, Loss and Grief Network and at ANU. So very warm welcome to you, Nicola.
Thanks, Sally.
And to Margaret. So Margaret is an educator with over 20 years experience in education, research, teacher professional learning and project management in the field of children's mental health, wellbeing and trauma. She's worked in various education settings both here in Australia and overseas, and is currently a senior trauma specialist at the ANU. So a very warm welcome to you, Margaret.
Thanks very much, Sally.
So moving on, before we get started, it's really important to take a moment to remember that when we're talking about mental health in any context, including trauma, it can all affect us in different ways. So as educators, we all come with our own unique experiences. And if there is anything that we cover today that raise any uncomfortable feelings for you, do feel free to opt out of the session. It will be recorded so that you're able to watch it at a later stage if you'd like to. We also really recognise the importance of educator self-care. And if you'd like to know more information about how to look after your own wellbeing, there's lots of information on our BU website, including where to go if you'd like to chat with someone. And check out the link on our questions box so that you can check out that page. We also recognise that you as educators already come with a wealth of experience and knowledge, and we're really keen for you to share this throughout the session today. And there's lots of ways that you can get involved. So you can answer the reflection questions that we pose throughout using the questions box, as well as ask any questions that you have and respond to some of our live polls. We'd love to know what you think. If you're having any technical difficulties, we've got Cass here who's on hand to lend you any technical assistance, again using that questions box to reach out to her. We will try and respond to as many questions as possible that you have today, particularly in our Q&A session that we'll have a little bit later on during the webinar. If we don't get a chance to answer your specific question, we'll also be putting together some post-webinar material that will pop onto our BU events page, including also some places where you can find some further reading if you're keen to learn more in this space. There'll be the recording of the webinar, and of course you'll also receive a certificate of participation for attending today. So all of those things we will aim to get out to you in the next couple of weeks. So let's launch into our topic for today, which is trauma-informed practice in your learning community. And like any good educator, I love a good learning outcome and learning objectives. So here's what we intend for you to learn about during today's session, which is divided into 3 sections. So first off, Nicola will provide a general overview of what is trauma, the prevalence of trauma and its impact on children's learning in a learning community setting. And then Margaret's going to look at more about what does this look like in practice? What can trauma-informed practice look like in your learning community? And we do really want today to be a practical session. We want you to have lots of tangible ideas about what you can take back to your learning communities and implement in your day-to-day practice. Then after in practice, we'll also look at next steps. So in terms of if you're after some additional support, where could you go to find that, as well as some resources for further reading. So during today's session, I'd like you to keep in mind that everything that we're learning today about trauma-informed practice can be beneficial to all children, including those who have experienced trauma, regardless of the source or the type. But also it'd be great for you to take the opportunity to think about what are you already doing in your practice, and you'll be surprised when you take the moment to think about that. You could actually be doing quite a lot, and thinking that it doesn't have to be great large task. It can actually be quite simple things that you do on a day-to-day basis, such as greet children by name and trying to set up regular routines, that sort of thing. All those actions, particularly if you're doing it as a whole learning community, can make a big difference over time. So definitely keep that in mind as we go through today's session. So without further ado, let's kick off with our first section today, which is understanding trauma. And I'll hand you over to Nicola. Thanks, Nicola.
Thanks, Sally, and welcome to everyone who joins us this afternoon. So as Sally mentioned, I'm going to take through this first section today where we look at some of the definitions of trauma and prevalence. I'm not going to spend too long because I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with the terminology and fully aware of just how prevalent trauma and adversity is, but it's helpful to set the context. But we are keen to get your feedback and to think about the young people that you're interacting with in your learning communities as we go along. So please contribute with your the polls and the chats and so forth, so we can make it as practical as possible. So if we move straight away, let's go into what do we mean by trauma. And Sally had already raised this just briefly a moment ago. When we talk about children who've experienced trauma and adversity, there's a lot of language that gets used around it. Some of them you can see on the screen there: type 1 versus type 2, relational, interpersonal, intergenerational, complex or community. The first point I want to make is that the strategies and the practices that we're talking about today are useful for all children, as Sally mentioned, and in particular, regardless of the type of adversity or trauma that they've experienced. So these practices are about children's belonging and engagement and capacity to learn and have positive relationships and reach their potential. But some of the quick differences, we do know that certain types of trauma do have much more profound impacts. So if it's relational, if it exists in relationship rather than being a kind of impersonal event like a car accident or a being struck by lightning. If you're hurt in relationship, we know that that really does can have much more pervasive impacts for children. Intergenerational trauma, where the trauma can be passed down by generation because of ongoing impacts of displacement or the sorts of things we've seen with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, where you've had really that intergenerational trauma of dispossession and ongoing discrimination can have profound effects for whole communities. And community trauma can capture that, but also capture events that affect everybody within a community, large or small. Now, they can be either natural disasters, bushfire or flood, but also they can be things such as traumatic events such as car accidents in a small community or the death of a loved one. So there's a lot of language around trauma, but rather than being caught up on that, we really want to focus on what you can do to support children regardless of what they've been through. So if we want to move on and have a think about what do we mean by trauma-informed practice. When I think about trauma-informed practice, whether or not it's in an educational setting, a learning setting, or a health setting, it really is a combination of what I think about as knowledge and perspective. We sometimes think about it as the trauma lens. And what I mean by that, the knowledge that we want people to have an understanding of is how prevalent trauma is. So it's not a small problem, and we'll talk a bit more about the numbers as we go along, but it's unfortunately more prevalent than we would like. And to understand its impacts, so its pervasive impacts on children's development, their relationships, and their behaviour at times as well. So an understanding of the fundamentals of trauma and its impacts, but also a perspective and a point of view, a stance of curiosity and wonder about what might be going on for a child when they are unable to contain their distress or calm down in a way that you would expect them to. So the perspective, a trauma-sensitive perspective, is a place of curiosity, not to know what is going on for that child, i.e. what has happened to them in the past, not digging for details, but a curiosity about what are they really struggling with at the moment and what can I do to help them. So that's, I suppose, my overview of what trauma-informed practice is and a framing space that we are launching into today. So the poll that we have up here, which we'd love you to participate in, asks you to what extent you think your learning community is aware of trauma-informed practice. I know there's a lot of talk about it in the community, and a lot of fantastic work is exploding across the countries over the last 10 years. So I'd be fascinated to see exactly from our audience how aware they think their communities are. Because I think there's a lot of talk about it. I think there's a lot of disparate work being done in this place. I think one of the challenges that we see is in implementing it and sustaining its implementation. So the poll is coming along, and I think we've got a real mix here. So we have 15% of you stating that there's very limited awareness, the majority having some awareness, very aware but not in practice, 20%, so 1 in 5, and 9% embedded in practice. And that's fantastic. I don't know what I would have predicted. I think that probably tees up. I mean, I think we run trauma sensitive practice in schools in the ACT, and we've probably managed to embed it in 10% of the schools there. So that probably marks up with what we've got here. So that will just gives all of us a bit of an indication as well around the level of awareness. So we've got the majority have some or limited awareness. So hopefully after today, they'll have more awareness and we can have some structured ideas for you to get this stuff implemented. So thanks for your feedback. So if we go on to the next stage where we're thinking about why would we use trauma-informed practice? Well, as I mentioned, the prevalence is more than we would like it to be. So Australian data, we know that 2 out of 3 children in Australia under the age of 16 will have experienced at least one adversity or traumatic event in their life, and that can have an impact on their learning and engagement. And 20% of children, so 1 in 5 in your educational and learning settings, have experienced multiple adversities. That's 3 or more in their short lives. And 3 plus is quite important because we know at that level it really does increase the chances of children having difficulties engaging in school and learning to the best of their capacity. It seems to be a bit of a tipping point. And unfortunately for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, we know that their exposure to adversity is much higher, as we've discussed before. So why trauma-informed practice? Because 20% of the kids in your classrooms at least will have experienced levels of adversity that could be really impacting them, and we know it helps. So if we move on from the prevalence and start to look at the case studies. These were sent to you earlier, and I know we had some great feedback of people completing them. We've got two young people for you to think about here. James, a 3.5-year-old. If you haven't read through it or yet, I encourage you to now. James, who's had, because his mum in hospital and some changing in his caregivers. And also the next case study, for those of you that perhaps work in the primary setting, is more relevant, is Vicky, who's a 12-year-old and having experienced a natural disaster. Her parents are quite concerned about her well-being. So I encourage you to review those cases if you haven't already, and we would love to hear any reflections that you have on how you might support these children. You can comment on either of the case studies and let us know what you think about what your environment would do in these situations. How would you manage some of the behaviours that you're seeing? You're seeing a lot of additional distress. In the first case study with Vicky, you have some behaviours that are quite tricky to manage in terms of disengage, but also aggression in the school place and leaving without permission, which is obviously a very difficult thing for schools to manage. Now, we will, as we go along today, we'll come back to review these cases and look at them again with the trauma lens once Margaret's taken us through the BRACE model. So if you have any reflections on those, we'd love to hear them. We have some ideas about how we might want to work with Vicky or the other cases to support them in their learning environments. We can see that there's some notions around diagnosis for Vicky, for example. Is that helpful? How does that help in terms of practical strategies that her teachers in the school or the executive in the school could help her to feel safe and connected? So as we go along, we can feedback any of the reflections that you've had. We haven't had any yet, so someone be brave and send us through your reflections, or if you don't feel comfortable doing so, maybe hang off and we've got another opportunity later in the webinar. So we might feed that through as we get any other reflections, but we'll move on and have a little bit more of a deep look into trauma-sensitive practice. So the impacts of exposure to traumatic events really are pervasive across mental health, physical health, behaviour and learning, and that is because of the vulnerability of young people to exposure to adverse experiences. As you are all very well aware from the training you've had in development and the developmental stages, there's a massive amount of growth and development going on in the early years of life. And what we know is, contrary to prior hope, I think, or opinion, was that if kids were too little, they weren't impacted by frightening events, or if they were exposed to family violence, they can't remember it because they were a baby. Now, unfortunately, what we know now to be true is the younger a child is when exposed to adversity, whether it be interpersonal violence or neglect or abuse, or even living in really chaotic environments, the younger a child is, the more pervasive the impact can be. And that's because of just the sheer level of development that's going on in the child at that time. The other thing that we know is we see behaviour. And so the iceberg analogy, I'm sure, again, is something that is very familiar to educators, where we see the behaviour, but the iceberg, in terms of what's behind that behaviour or the needs that that behaviour is trying to express, is really a bit harder to see in the first instance. And the trauma-sensitive approach asks us to look behind with a question around what's going on for this child, what might have set them off, is there something going on that's making them feel really unsafe in this environment and therefore reacting in the way they are. So if we have a look at some of these in a bit more detail in terms of the impacts of trauma on the brain, again, educators will be familiar with brain development. This is an adaptation of a model of brain development. So on the left hand, the typical development shows a kind of representation of how the brain is built over time. So the brain is built in all of us sequentially over time. When we're born, we are born with the kind of framework of our brain, the brainstem in place, but really just built for survival. So we have a capacity to regulate temperature and hunger and to shiver, those sorts of things that keep us alive, but we're really dependent, absolutely dependent on adults in our lives to keep us alive. Over time, through the early years and through teenage years and into adulthood, we now know the brain develops up through the more sophisticated and complex tasks up to cognition, the prefrontal cortex, the top part of the brain, thinking, planning, problem solving, risk management, and the part of the brain that we really need to engage to learn. So in typical development, you can see the triangle. The majority of the development over time, we're ruling from the top part of our brain and really only a small part from the base part of our brain when we need to. But on the right-hand side, you can see developmental trauma, which is again another jargon, which is really what we use to refer to children who have been exposed to ongoing interpersonal trauma. So people who are living in houses where they're exposed to chaos, exposed to violence, exposed to abuse or neglect in an ongoing and sustained way. And it really reshapes how their brain develops because they're focused on survival. They don't have the luxury of feeling safe and secure, and therefore being able to operate from the higher parts of their brain. Their brain, in the use it or lose it capacity that we have, is focused on keeping them safe, and so really is based in that survival part of the brain, the amygdala, the alert system. A lot of people have heard of fight, flight, or freeze. We can see some of those behaviours in the case study, particularly with Vicky. So when she's nicking off from school, we all know bolters, kids that just run. We would see that as a flight response. So they're running, they're feeling unsafe, and they haven't necessarily made a choice, but they are fleeing a situation because that's what their brain is telling them is the safest thing to do in that circumstance. So when children have been exposed in an ongoing way to trauma and unsafe situations, their brain is the kind of parts of their brain that are used the most, the amygdala and the alert system. We know that they're actually bigger in kids who've experienced trauma and adversity. And what that means is their amygdala, their alert system, goes off more easily. They have a hair trigger. It stays on for longer, and it's really hard for them to calm down again. And so that has really significant impacts in the learning environments because you have two kids sitting next to each other and one of them responding to a situation, say a raised voice or a bang. It could be anything, could be a smell, it could be a sound. And one child has a very moderate response and the other child seems to have an extreme response. And I think it's a good thing to remember that if you see a response, a behavior that you think is completely out of kind of sync with what it should be, so it's a 10 out of 10 reaction for a 3 out of 10 situation, I would invite you at that time to park your response and be curious. So something has gone on to make that a 10 out of 10 response for that child. You don't necessarily need to know exactly what that was, but stepping back and thinking that seems to be more going on behind that behavior than what's happening in this classroom. That's what we would call a trigger. Something has gone on that's really evoked a response in that child. So that's a couple of minutes on brain development. There's a lot of resources out there that we could go into a lot more detail, but we just want to introduce these notions to you today. And so if we go on now, the yin to the yang of brain development is attachment. And what we mean by attachment is the relationship between a child and its primary caregiver. So it's mum, the grandmother, the father, the foster parent, whoever is primarily responsible for bringing and raising a child is their primary attachment figure. And they really do a lot more than just feed and keep a child warm. The way an attachment figure relates to its child, so the way a parent meets or does not meet consistently the needs of a child, whether it be to be fed, to be soothed, to be comforted, to be enjoyed, shapes the child's brain. So it's not just the exposure to frightening events, it's how your caregiver relates to you. It shapes your brain in terms of its responses that we've talked about, its responsivity, but also your view of yourself and your view of the world. So you can only develop a view of yourself, whether you're a good kid, a likable kid, a friendly kid, a successful kid, in relation with other. And so we all know children that come into our lives that kind of bounce into an early childhood setting, for example, and their expectation is if they've had good enough pairing and a safe and secure relationship, that you as adults that are taking care of them that day are going to be safe, are going to be interested in them, are going to feed them, and they're going to look after them. However, if another child comes in whose experience as adults is that they're unpredictable, that they are mean, that they hurt, or that they are really just not that interested in you, and if you express emotions or if you show interest, then that child has experienced pain, they're not going to trust you. They're not going to engage in a way straight away. They're going to be wary of you because that's protective. And so children bring their attachment relationships, their view of the world of adults and their place in it, into our educational settings and learning settings. And so an understanding of the different attachment styles. So kids that are very aloof and seem to really want to disengage and can sometimes be controlling, and those sorts of patterns are a result of early experiences. Kids that are excessively at times clingy and needy and anxious, that can be a result of their early attachment experiences as well. So having an understanding of those attachment relationships can be really helpful in having effective strategies to help those kids thrive and feel safe in schools. Okay, and related to attachment, as I mentioned, is the child's view of themselves. So not only their view of adults and how they can be seen, but very much, am I okay? So you can only have a view of yourself as a likable child, a lovable child, a child that can succeed if those adults around you have given you those messages, that have met your needs. Not 100% of the time. I think the data is around 30% of the time. So all of us that are parents as well can relax. You can't meet your children's needs all the time. But a view of yourself as capable and lovable is essential for relationships and also for being able to engage in learning and play. Now, we've all had experiences of offering praise to a child that is thrown back in our face. We sometimes can find it really hurtful and it's hard to understand. Again, an understanding or a curiosity or just a stopping and thinking, how can this child not receive this compliment? What is it about the compliment that is too much for them? Or just stopping and say, rather than seeing it as a personal rejection, this child can't cope with this at this time, in the same way that some children can't cope at really complex maths at this stage. So this child doesn't need less compliments, they actually need more, because we need to repair that sense of self through relationship, but they need it in really small doses. So again, it's a pause and thinking about how you're interacting, what might be getting in the way of this child being able to receive the comfort they need or the attention they need, and how can I help them to receive it in a way that is tolerable for them. And they will get there, but it's going to take a bit of time and support. Okay, so moving through now, we'll have a look at some of the behaviours, and we've purposely put this last because it's, again, something that you guys are all very familiar with, but I think some of the concepts are worth pointing out. Behaviours in the jargon of psychology and other allied health are often referred to as internalising and externalising. All we mean by that is some kids act out and they're easy to spot. So the kids that flip their lid, are aggressive, might trash the classroom or be aggressive towards other children, we refer to them as externalising behaviours. They're obvious signs of distress. Their anger, which is often a mask or an acceptable or the only way they know to express sadness, despair, embarrassment, confusion, all of those sorts of things that are happening inside the child. So there's externalising behaviours, harder to spot and harder to support sometimes are the kids that experience internalising issues, and that's more the withdrawn, anxious, or sometimes very compliant kids that are super good all the time. And so it's important to know that both of those things can exist in the same child. We all have a kind of template of what we're more likely to do, either more acting out or more withdrawing. And a real challenge for educators in all learning settings is you probably have a couple of each in your classroom, and so the internalising behaviours are harder to spot because a child that is kind of spaced out in their own world, worried and sad, is harder to pick up and support, particularly if you've got a couple of kids kind of pegging chairs across the room or acting in much more unsafe ways, physically unsafe ways. So, but it's worth keeping that in mind. I remember running a session with some early childhood educators a few years ago, and she spoke about a situation not unlike our case study actually, where 4-year-old twins, the mum had gone into hospital and they'd been there for a long time and they didn't really know what was going on. And the educator said to me, so one of the twins is doing really well and doesn't seem to be affected, and the other one is kind of off the Richter, you know, fighting, throwing things, really distressed, crying and yelling all the time. And so what can I do for that twin? And we just stopped and had a conversation around what made her so sure that that first child was not upset. and not just keep it, because it would seem an unusual response that one child was completely unaffected. So, and when she stopped and reflected and engaged with that family over time, of course, both children were equally confused and upset, and just they didn't know where their mum was because no one had talked to them about it. So just important to remember that we can't necessarily tell exactly what's going on for a child just by looking at their behaviour. And this last concept here is developmental versus chronological age. The summary of this, which is a really helpful concept to hold in mind. I find it really helpful working with families. Educators, parents are really good at kind of talking about how the child is acting a certain age. So say you're working with a 10-year-old, or you have a year 2 class, but somebody in that class is acting in a way that's much younger. So the 10-year-old's acting like a 5-year-old, or some of the kids in the kindy class are behaving like preschoolers or behaving like toddlers. That's what I think about developmental versus chronological age, particularly kids who've experienced trauma and adversity. When they are stressed or when they are pressured, will regress in their behaviours. And so again, thinking about the first case study, we've got a classic example of that: return to increased clinginess and need for security, developmentally gone back a little bit, not necessarily forever, but in the immediate moment. And so it's really helpful to think about, if a child is not acting their age, what age are they acting, and how can we scaffold them at that developmental level? Doesn't mean talking to them in a baby voice, but in terms of what would you do if you had a child that age, a 2-year-old, a toddler, or a 5-year-old versus a 10-year-old, to get them through their day and get them kind of connected and grounded and back on task. And so the other way we can also have the precociousness that can come out versus after exposure to trauma and adversity with children acting older than their age. Somebody has asked about it. It doesn't necessarily indicate trauma. It might indicate responsibility. It rolls within the family. It can indicate sibling order, as we would all know. Older children and families often tend to have responsibilities for caring for young ones, or children who are young carers themselves, or living with people with parents with mental illness or chronic physical illness, often have additional responsibility and burden in their home lives, and that can not be problematic at all in terms of them acting older. It can be problematic as well, of course, particularly if they're acting in really risky ways. And so nothing's definite. Certainly if you're really concerned about a child acting much older than their age in a precocious way, perhaps risk-taking around drugs or sexual activity and so forth, then you'd want to check in with them around their safety and what was going on. So there's not necessarily one definitive thing that indicates trauma, and the important thing is you don't need to know for certain. Of course, if there's safety risks, you want to check that out, but these responses and interactions that Margaret's going to take you through shortly are great for all kids. So looking about how we can connect with children, build relationships, help them feel safe and secure in their learning environments are beneficial for all kids, regardless of their level of exposure to trauma and adversity. And we all have adversity, so you can't get through life without it. So it's time for another poll, and we've talked a little bit about the sorts of behaviours that all of you will be exposed to every day in your learning environments. So it'll be really helpful for us and interesting, I think, to understand what sorts of behaviours that you find most challenging to manage in your setting. We were having a conversation around this the other day. Certainly, and we all have preferences. So I've worked a lot in the past with children and young boys in particular who've expressed a lot of anger and aggression. I actually really like working with those young boys. I call them my sad boys, because that's most often when we work together over time, when I asked them what they're feeling just before they got really angry, the answer was inevitably sad. And so working with them around emotional expression and finding other ways to express that I found really helpful and delightful, really, whereas other people find much more, are really, really talented at working with those withdrawn children that are very anxious and so forth. So let's have a look. Okay, so pretty clear: defiance and anger or aggression coming through very strongly as something that can be challenging to manage. So clinginess, so there's regression in clingy behaviours. You guys seem to be more comfortable with, or less of you are finding that challenging, and sad or withdrawn. That's fascinating, and I think that's probably pretty consistent with what we've seen when we go in and work with schools. One of the biggest issues that people have is, how do we manage behaviour, and how do you work in a trauma sensitive way that isn't letting kids off the hook? So we can come back to that. I think the one thing I'll say before I hand over, because I'm out of time, is that thinking about anger as aggression or defiance as being emotions that kids are often told, or the only ones that they have witnessed as being acceptable, and more vulnerable feelings of sadness, hurt, loneliness are not. They don't have demonstrations of them. And so when we teach kids how to get in touch with those feelings, and it's okay to show them in our environment, you can often have real reductions in that anger or aggression. But I'll leave you with that thought. And I'm pretty sure now I'm handing over to Margaret, who is going to take you through this in practice. So thank you, and I'll join you again a bit later on in the session.
Thanks a lot, Nicola, and lovely to be able to join with you this afternoon. And so this next section, I suppose we're still wanting to hold in mind those case studies that we were given, and also that first poll that we did around what your current understanding is, and just looking at trauma sensitive practices that can be in schools, and how we can look at not adding on even more work, but actually hopefully this afternoon identifying things that you're already doing that can be part of a trauma sensitive framework for you to work in within your school. So I'd like you to keep that in mind. And also I noticed that there were a number of you who said that yes, you have some awareness and there is some embedding in your schools, and it would be great now for you to actually start sharing ideas as we're talking, so that you can I think as teachers, we often learn the best when we hear what other people are doing. So I'd really encourage you to be responding and share ideas as I'm going through. I'm going to speak, and I'll ask for the next slide. So I'm going to present today this BRACE framework, which is a trauma sensitive school framework. And this really operationalizes all those things, that those areas that Nicola has been looking at, and saying, okay, what do they look like within our learning environments? And so you can see there, BRACE looks at belonging, routine, attachment, capacity, and emotions. And this framework was developed at the ANU as part of the TRUST program, which is around trauma sensitive schooling. And as we go through, I'm going to look at what each of those elements of BRACE are, as well as looking at what do they look like in the classroom, what do they look like in policy. Again, if it is, I start talking about things and you go, oh yeah, I already do that. Oh yes, our school already does that. That's what we're wanting. We're not wanting you to leave today and say, oh, not more things I have to do totally differently. Hopefully this will be a time when you can go, yeah, I've learned about that, or I used to do that and it's kind of dropped off my radar. And then today will be a chance for you to think about those things, and so that you can bring them in to part of the discussions. Now I'm also, as I'm talking, we're also getting through some of the chats, and if we don't get to those things now, we can also get to them during the Q&A time as well. So let's just start off looking at the notion of belonging as part of a sensitive school strategy. So the B for BRACE is obviously belonging, and that's around connectedness to staff and peers, where your learning community provides a safe and secure environment, physically and emotionally. Now, it's important in this to also recognise that as all of our children are different, and as we are different, our understanding of what a safe and secure environment can be different for each of us. And so when we say as a school, oh yes, we've got a safe and secure environment, we need to be starting to check in and go, have we? And are the kids actually feeling safe and supported? And how do we know that? What measures are we thinking about that say, yes, they're sharing with each other. It's a gentle environment. So that's one of the things to keep in mind. And the other thing is that it's that engagement around children and their families. And that's part of that belonging. Belonging includes things like, what is it? As far as what does it look like on a daily thing? It can mean things like meeting and greeting your kids by name when they come in and when they go out. It's about knowing what's going on for those kids, whether it's just like a quick chat about, hey, I know you're barrack for whatever football team, or I understand you had a ballet concert, or you were going to do such and such. How did that go? Showing the kids that you recognise that they have a life outside of the school, and that belongs here within our school environment, and we can talk about it. We want the kids to feel like they belong. Also, things like circle time are really important ways where we check in with kids at the beginning of the day or the end of the day, and that's another way of being able to really help kids feel like they belong. As far as policies and procedures and programs at schools, social emotional wellbeing programs that again highlight to the kids that everybody belongs, everybody has a place, everybody is validated. How do we get on? What does that look like within our school? Looking also at bullying programs is another way that we can look at making sure that kids are not excluded within schools. So that kind of gives you a bit of an idea, and already I'm sure you're thinking, oh yeah, we have that in our school. So be thinking about that as we go on. The next element of BRACE is around routine, routines across your learning community, and making sure that they're predictable, and also a consistent approach to learning and behaviour across the learning community. Now, very important, this notion of predictability. Children, whether they've experienced trauma, whether they're going through a tough time, or generally they're kids who like to know what's going to be happening next. So having routines in our timetables, having visual cues put up for younger students in early learning environments, being able to have those so children know what's going to be happening today. If there's a break because you've got school photos or you've got the practice for a particular performance for choir, making sure that you step children through knowing what that will look like. What time are we going to be packing up? What's going to happen? Who's going to take us? Because although we might sort of go, oh, it's fine, look, they've done it before, for some children, this can be a real sense of anxiety for them. And that's where we can see that withdrawal, or we can see that acting out, because they're not quite sure what to do with being so uncertain. And so, as Nicola was saying before, they either drive that internally or they share it with it externally by, carrying on. And you always go, oh, every time we go to do this child, they always just go crazy whenever we have to go out or line up. Again, it could be by sitting or working alongside them to say, hey, listen, we've got practice for the school production. That's going to look like this. And I'm going to be there, or Mrs. So-and-so, or whoever is going to be there. That's a great way of just checking in and stepping through and scaffolding those children who need a little bit more scaffolding. And keeping in mind, as Nicola said, we might be saying, look, these kids are in grade 5. They should know how to do this. However, their chronological age, because of the experiences they've had, because of what they might be dealing with at home, might not allow them to be at that age, and they might need that extra scaffolding along to help. So that notion of routine. The other thing is bringing in rituals, and kids love this in schools where they know, for example, that Friday afternoon is finishing off and fun time. And again, I've no doubt you're going, oh yeah, we already do that. So I'm not trying to say this is rocket science. It's like, look at what you're already doing and congratulate your school on what you're already doing. And let's look at how we can promote more of those. The third element for the brace is looking at attachment. And this is around looking at all staff developing a relationship with their children, so, and also with families. And this is around making sure that the child has a place to belong and a staff member that they feel that they are comfortable with, and looking that what you build up within one year, and as the child then moves on to the next, the person from that first year will still be there and is still consistent, even if the child moves on to another class. The other thing to look around this is also whether, as staff, that we look at those interactions around what might be the children that we find it easier to attach with or to get on with, and then those other ones, as we showed in those polls, those other ones where we try really hard but we really struggle, and being aware of that, being self-reflective of that. Then the next element of brace is looking at capacity, and this is around promoting the strengths of children, looking at what can kids do, where are they at, where are their individual learning plans at. Are we really working from an area of strength? Are we scaffolding? Are we standing beside kids like Vicky in our case study and going, hey, she's not completing the homework. What does she need from us? And working alongside, being with her, breaking things up, chunking things so that it's achievable, so success is given, and so there's that sense that she can do it and that you're with her and supporting her. And then finally, if we look at emotions, and this emotional regulation, looking at how we can recognise, and this goes for both staff, goes for children, and also goes for our leadership. So within our learning settings, so looking at our own emotions, being self-reflective, how do we regulate those emotions, how do we express them in schools, what are we doing as far as, what are the ways that we are modelling within our learning environment, and what are we doing to be able to assist then our students in our care to be able to recognise and to express and to model their own emotional regularity. And this can come through social emotional wellbeing programs, and there are a lot of them out there that are excellent, that really can assist kids. It can be all the cues you put up in your classroom that help kids work out where they are, like an emotional thermometer, or it might be building a little breakout area where children can just go and take themselves away to be able to self-regulate and to be able to bring themselves down. So that's really looking at that brace model. And so if we want to now go back to those case studies that we started with, and just to be able to go back through those, now looking at them through the lens of what Nicola was speaking about, and then also looking at that brace model. And we look at a child like James and we start to think about, we've got some attachment things because mum's gone away, we've got somebody new coming into his life, what can we do as his learning environment? And that again might be around making that connection with James, making the connection with the family, making sure that we've got some common language and a common approach with James, with the grandmother, with the family around what's happening and an understanding. It might be working with James about developing a little visual calendar, a diary about when he is going to visit mum. Maybe it's something that he can take from school to take into mum. And so all of these little things where we can work with James around being able to recognise what's going on for him, including his, little bit of his regression. So there's a bit of wetting himself and the clinginess, and being able to look at this with another lens and saying, what is it that James needs from us now? Looking at that brace model and going through those various steps and saying what elements from this might be able to assist James. And what would be a good reflection for you to think about is, if you now take what we've done, think about what you're doing and what is your learning community already doing to support James. And then we've got Vicky, and looking at Vicky and thinking about, as Nicola's mentioned earlier, we've got some, the way that she's acting out. I've sort of touched a little bit on the fact that breaking down the way that we might be expecting Vicky to respond to various learning activities, so that we can make sure that Vicky's actually experiencing success, that school and still having expectations about routines and expectations about ways of her to be completing tasks, but saying, how can we do this so that it is manageable and successful, and that she can then also be able to continue with her learning and feel like she has a place within that school. Being aware that the stomach aches and things like that may be looked at through with a different lens, rather than, oh, she's just trying to get out of it, and things like this, and just trying to really work alongside her so she feels like the school and that her teachers are holding her in mind, that they're aware of what's going on, they're supportive, they still have strong expectations, they still have boundaries, still have routines, but they are holding her in mind and just being able to renegotiate things. So then if you move on to we're now going to be moving on to question and answer, and we have a bit of time to be able to look at your questions that you have, and I think Nicola's going to join us as well. So invite you to be sending in yours. I think we have some that have already been sent in, so I'll hand over to Sally, Nicola to start looking at these.
Thanks, Margaret.
Nicola,
yeah, you go ahead, Sally.
Oh no, I was going to say I'll pass on to you, because I know there's been a flurry of questions, and thank you for sending those in, folks, and please continue to do so. And just remembering that those questions that are unanswered today, we will definitely get a chance to answer in our post-webinar material that will be available on our BU events page in the next couple of weeks. And also some really great ideas coming through that we might take some key themes of that, and so that we can share our expertise with one another. I think that's a really great opportunity to be able to draw on the expertise with this this brains trust that we have today. So Nicola, I know a few questions have been flicked through to you. Did you want to get started?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think so. There are a couple of questions that have come through about how can you tell? So how can you tell the difference between a child who's experienced trauma or has a learning difficulty, or does a child who's expressing ongoing extreme anger always have had trauma? And so that questioning around knowing, and I think I'm grouping those together because I want to make two quick points, because there's a lot of questions. One of which is you don't need to know. So nothing really, as I said before, is dead set, this child has experienced trauma. There's certainly really strong indications. If we take the example of, if a child is expressing ongoing and extreme anger and aggression, have they had trauma? If that child is experiencing ongoing and extreme anger, they're experiencing ongoing and extreme distress, is how I would phrase it. So trauma sensitive practices are exactly what that child needs to help them develop the skills to express their distress, which is what anger and aggression is, in a way that is more constructive. And the second question around can you tell between trauma and learning difficulty, it can be really difficult. Again, the strategies that Margaret's just taken you through around belonging and scaffolding and routine are beneficial for children that have experienced trauma and who have significant learning difficulties. There's also a question about autism, so I'm going to try and wrap these up together, because these strategies work really well for kids that have got diagnoses such as autism or other learning difficulties. We've implemented our Trauma Sensitive Schools program into schools that work and provide support for kids who have very significant autism and learning difficulties and so forth, and the strategies there have been, the trauma sensitive strategies have been phenomenal, because the structure, the routine, the predictability, the explicitness, and I think that's one of the things these schools have taught us, that they hadn't necessarily explicitly taught some of the things that they needed in terms of, for those children, about how to name feelings or what behaviour is or isn't acceptable. So I think if we can step back from trying to know what a kid's been through, that's less important than thinking these strategies are helpful for all kids. So trying to knock off a few questions with those ones. I think one of the things that, Margaret, I might throw to you too, is, again, there's a couple of questions around attachment. So we've had two separate questions on each side. So how do you create belonging for kids who are clingy, on that attachment side, or how do you include kids that have excluded themselves due to their negative behaviour? So I was just wondering, Margaret, if you have any comments on belonging for kids that are particularly clingy, to help them feel seen and supported, and kids that have maybe had a rupture and in the relationship with their peers and their classmates, how we can bring them back in.
And I will be, they're huge questions, I will be brief, but what I'd like to preface it with is that it is important this is seen as ongoing work. It's not a one-off, I just need to do one thing and then this will be something that will cure or, you know, change totally what's happening with the child. So for me, it's always around relationships, and it is first of all establishing that relationship with whether the child is withdrawing or whether the child is acting out. And so once you can start to establish that relationship, you can have the conversations with the children around what is it that they're thinking that they need, and that is for both. On both extremes. I think that notion of the child that withdraws and is keeping well to themselves, and again being able to honour that, but by being able to approach them quietly, to just be able to gently let them know that you're there, that you are working to get to know them, and then over time being able to talk to them about and encourage them about ways that they might want to become more engaged within the class and with their peers, and what that might look like for them, and give them some agency around that, how that might happen. For the child that's acting out and that has that rupture, it can be around working with the whole class, as well as working with that child and helping them to understand around the impact of what might be happening for them, and then the impact that their behaviour might be having on others. But again, it's all within the context of a relationship, and being able to be with that child and assuring them that you're there, that you're listening to them, and that you're wanting to make contact, and for them to be able to hear what it is that they're wanting to have happen. And that also often, as you mentioned, Nicola, people then think, oh no, you know, you're letting children get away with things. Most children want to be part of their peer group, and these ruptures might be because they're not quite sure how to do that. There might be another frustration, there might be other things going on, and so being able to really work through a relationship where you are listening to the child and being able to support them step by step, building the skills, listening to them, for me would be the way that I would be approaching that. And it can be time. It's not one conversation.
Thank you, Margaret, for that comprehensive answer, and mindful of time. So and thank you so much to everyone for sending through those questions. We'll definitely include them in the post-webinar material. And I'm also thinking, just in terms of next steps, we might actually list those next steps in the post-webinar material, because that's something that you can read a little bit later. But we've got some ideas about internal and external sources of additional support, as well as further reading. We've got those up on the screen there now. And if I just move to the next slide, also some ideas for further reading that we'll include in that post-webinar material. And just moving on to the next one, we definitely encourage you to go to the BU website to learn a little bit more, and also register as an individual educator and as a whole learning community if you haven't already done so. And I just want to quickly take this opportunity to thank you all for joining us today. Gee, that hour goes quickly, doesn't it? It's such it's a fantastic topic that we can talk for hours on, and it's been so great hearing your comments and your questions come through. We very much value them. So if we can just pop to the next slide, and I just want to take this opportunity to and we'll move on to the final slide there. But I take this opportunity to thank you very much to our subject experts today, Nicola and Margaret, for your wealth of information and sharing so many insights and your expertise today. It's been invaluable, and I think I talk on behalf of all the participants in the comments that we've been getting through. We've really appreciated it. So very much thank you to you, and thank you to all of the participants, all of you out there, educators who are listening in. We're going to wrap up now. So when we finish the webinar, you'll be prompted to fill out a survey, it's really important just to learn about what we can improve on, what you liked, but particularly what topics you're interested in learning about more. It might be more to do with trauma-informed practice. Please let us know on that post-webinar survey. So that's it from us. Thank you so much for your time today. We look forward to seeing you next time, and let's keep working together to grow a mentally healthy generation. Thanks all. Bye for now.